Katie and I put this presentation together and to tell our side of the story. I guess I got involved when DEQ started collecting the air data, and so let's go ahead. Sarah showed the slide that was a chart showing different metals levels in the air. I'll talk about that a little bit further. Based on this data, DEQ conducted air sampling near a facility in southeast Portland where there appeared to be a hotspot of cadmium. The air samples were collected for about a month, and when I got this data, I took a look at it and thought, oh, there's a few chemicals that are actually higher than levels of concern for human health for chronic exposures. And given that these facilities were operating for 40 years, I thought, that's interesting. So one of the things that DEQ didn't pick up on right away but I did is that chromium was also a potential concern because total chromium data was reported in their air data set, but the DEQ did not look at an air level for that right away, but I pulled in a hexavalent chromium air number, which is actually very, very low. So the chromium to me was a big red flag, raising my level of concern about the facility. The two glass facilities, these are two colored glass facilities, they voluntarily stopped using arsenic, cadmium, and chromium in their colored glass production. So the next slide actually shows a table of a short list of some of the metals that were collected in air. And this was, again, the October data. And I've presented minimum, maximum, and average values for each of these compounds over the month. We've also provided a background level for each of those that would be typical in urban air. And as you can see, chromium in the first column, arsenic, and cadmium, the average concentrations were all higher than the EPA RSLs. And RSLs are regional screening levels. They're the values that EPA risk assessors across the country use to screen chemicals. So if your chemicals are below the RSLs, we pretty much think, they're probably not a concern for human health. These are based on long-term exposures, long-term residential or long-term worker exposure. In this table, I selected residential exposures because both of these facilities are located in neighborhoods with houses nearby. I've indicated with a C whether the compound is a carcinogen, and the N indicates a non-carcinogenic value. So if a chemical has both, like cobalt, it can cause both carcinogenic effects and non-carcinogenic effects, such as effects on the kidneys or liver or other organs. And our screening levels are set at a risk level of 1 in a million for cancer, or a hazard quotient of 1 for non-cancer, which means that you set up a ratio of the level that someone is exposed to divided by a level that you think they could be exposed to that shouldn't have a health effect. And if that ratio is greater than 1, then that would be a concern. So for the non-carcinogens, you just don't want to exceed that level because that could potentially pose a risk. A couple of other notes on this. So as I said earlier, based on this initial monitoring back in October, the facility stopped using arsenic, cadmium, and chromium in colored glass. And notice that this actually had a ripple effect in companies that use these products. So these two companies provide a lot of colored glass to different industries that then use those materials in their manufacturing. So there's actually been a little bit of a ripple effect in that industry. Okay, moving to the next slide, I just included this particular headline as an example of a news story. There's been quite a lot of press about these issues in Portland, and I invite you to take time to look at some of the news stories online. There's been quite a bit of press and quite a bit of interest in this. So then what happened is, because these facilities stopped using certain metals in their glass production, Oregon DEQ went out and conducted additional air sampling beginning in February 2016, and that monitoring has continued. What you see here is a comparison of the October 2015 air results to the February 2016 air results. And again, both of these represent about a month's worth of data, and the data I've shown here are average concentrations in nanograms per cubic meter. What jumps out at me is arsenic, cadmium, and chromium all dropped dramatically. And so to me, that says something about that these facilities are actually contributing to air concerns for these metals. But what's interesting is some of the other metals drop as well. And Katie could probably speak to that better than me, but I know from talking with her that selenium is actually a substance that's used in production of certain glasses. So you can see that it's also dropped quite dramatically. In the middle of the slide, you see hexavalent chromium. And as I mentioned earlier, DEQ did not include speciated chromium in their monitoring in October, but they did add it in their more recent monitoring. And so you can see that the hexavalent chromium is just a small blip for the February monitoring, but that we just have no data for October, and we would expect that it would have been higher based on the total chromium concentrations. I think I've already hit the first bullet on this next slide, that given the dramatic decreases in air concentrations of these metals, especially arsenic, cadmium, and chromium, it is likely that the two-colored glass manufacturers were responsible for at least a portion of the metals detected in Portland's air back in October. The air concentrations while these facilities were operating historically probably indicate potential long-term air concentrations that could pose a health risk. And that is something that the Oregon Health Authority is looking into, evaluating that data. They're doing a public health assessment, which will be fall, and they'll be looking at potential chronic health effects from exposure to the air from these facilities. Something else that was done was Oregon DEQ conducted soil sampling around the facilities, because there was a concern that with the metals that had been released historically, that there would have been soil deposition and then potential exposure of people to soil in their yards, or in, there's actually a daycare nearby. And fortunately, the soil sampling conducted to date doesn't indicate high concentrations of soils, of metals in soils. So that was actually good news. And I wanted to let you know that the state has actually done a really good job in being very transparent in their data reporting. And I should have included it on this slide, but I will let you know you can find that data at www.saferairportland.org. And at this point, they're releasing weekly data with rolling averages. So kind of as they get a new data set, they're bringing that into the previous data sets for different locations around the city and around these two facilities. So I invite you to take a look at that if you're interested. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Katie.